The chandeliers of Beaumont House were a constellation of captured stars, dripping light onto the polished floor, the jewels of the dancers, and the silks of their gowns. From her corner, the light seemed to stop short, as if it recognized she was not part of the spectacle. Adela Marsh stood beside a potted palm, a ghost in grey bombazine, the fabric chosen by her employer, Lady Honoria Beaumont, for its remarkable ability to absorb light and attention. Her purpose here was simple. She was to be a repository. She held Lady Beaumont's cashmere shawl, her feathered fan, and a small beaded reticule. Should her employer feel a chill, grow too warm, or require a vinaigrette, Adela was to materialize at her elbow, offer the required object, and then melt back into the shadows. She was furniture that breathed. For 2 hours, she had perfected the art of stillness. She watched the whirl of color and sound, a river in which she was not permitted to swim. The music of the orchestra washed over her, a language from a country she could not visit. She knew no one, and no one knew her. It was the precise arrangement Lady Beaumont preferred. An audience of one for her employer's triumphs, and an invisible lackey for her needs. The sheer force of her personality, you mean? A voice drifted towards her. It was Lady Beaumont, holding court near the refreshment table. Her laughter, a sound like tiny breaking glass, followed. One must admire the ambition, if not the dress. Chartreuse, at her age. Adela kept her eyes fixed on a point above the crowd, on the painted cherubs frolicking on the ceiling. To look at her employer was to invite notice, and notice was always a prelude to a task or a correction. "And the Duke of Whitchurch," another lady murmured, her voice conspiratorial. "He has not danced once. He simply stands there, by the hearth, looking as though he is calculating the cost of the entire evening in shillings and pence." "He is in mourning, of course," Lady Beaumont said, though her tone held little sympathy. "For his brother? A tragedy, naturally. But it has been nearly a year. A man of his station cannot be a statue forever. He has a duty to his line." A duty. Adela understood duty. Her own was to remain upright, silent, and ready. Her feet ached. The grey dress, a cast-off of her employer's, refitted by her own hand, was tight across the shoulders. She had been standing since they arrived. "Look at him now," Lady Beaumont continued, her voice sharpening with a familiar, predatory interest. "He's moving, finally, towards the Penhurst girl, I imagine. A face like a doll, and a dowry the size of a small county." Adela allowed her gaze to drift, just for a second, towards the fireplace. The Duke of Whitchurch was indeed moving. He was a tall man, made taller by his severe black coat, which seemed to drink the light as her own dress did. But where hers was the grey of mice and dust, his was the black of jet and midnight. He moved with a liquid grace that was at odds with the rigid set of his jaw. His hair was raven black, his face a collection of sharp, aristocratic planes. He was not looking towards the pretty, doll-like Miss Penhurst. He was not looking at any of the expectant debutantes or their hopeful mammas. His eyes were fixed on the corner by the potted palm. On her. Adela's heart did not leap. It simply stopped. A cold, hard knot in her chest. This was a mistake. A gentleman of his rank did not look at a paid companion. He was looking at the plant, perhaps, or at the tapestry behind her. She forced herself to become even more still, to recede further into the wall. But he did not stop. He walked past the glittering shoals of young ladies. He navigated the currents of gossip and champagne. He came directly, inexorably towards her. Each step was a drumbeat against the floor of her composure. The conversations nearest her faltered. A small, silent eddy formed around them. Lady Beaumont, mid-sentence, turned. Her perfectly painted lips parted in disbelief. The Duke of Whitchurch stopped before Adela. He was so close she could see the fine weave of his coat, the stark white of his cravat. His eyes, she saw now, were not black, but a deep, tawny brown, like whiskey held to the light. They held no warmth, only an unnerving, assessing intelligence. He did not smile. He simply looked at her, at the grey dress, at the shawl draped over her arm. He took in the whole, unadorned picture of her. "Miss," he said. His voice was a low baritone, quiet, yet it carried in the sudden hush. "May I have the honour of this dance?" The world tilted. The potted palm, the chandeliers, the painted cherubs, they all swam in her vision. This was not happening. It was a dream, or a cruel jest. She looked past his shoulder, searching for the source of the prank. There was none. Only a sea of stunned, staring faces. She felt the sharp, furious heat of Lady Beaumont's gaze on her back. This was a disaster, a catastrophe. To accept was an unthinkable breach of her station. To refuse a duke was an unthinkable insult. She was trapped. Her own voice, when it came, was a thread. "Your Grace, you mistake me. I am—" She could not say it. "I am a servant. I am nobody. I do not mistake you," he said, his voice unwavering. The almost smile from the other night, the one she had seen in the park, was nowhere in evidence. He was entirely serious. "I am asking you to dance." 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Every eye in the room was on them. Every breath was held. She could feel her employment, her meagre lodgings, her entire precarious existence, crumbling. But in that moment, something else rose up in its place. A flicker of defiance she had thought long extinguished. She had been invisible all night. Now she was excruciatingly seen. And if she was to be seen, she would not be seen cowering. She met his gaze. "I do not have a dance card, Your Grace." A muscle twitched in his jaw. It might have been surprise. It might have been approval. "Then we shall not need one." He held out a gloved hand. Slowly, as if moving through water, Adela transferred the fan and reticule to one hand and laid the cashmere shawl over the back of a vacant chair. Her movements were precise, deliberate. She was not a flustered girl. She was a woman making a choice. She placed her trembling, ungloved hand in his. His grip was firm, cool. He led her onto the floor. The orchestra, after a moment of stunned hesitation, struck up a waltz. The other couples moved aside, clearing a space as if for royalty, or for a spectacle. Adela was not sure which. He placed a hand on her waist. The grey bombazine was a useless barrier against the sudden, shocking heat of his touch. She rested her other hand on his shoulder, her fingers barely grazing the fine wool of his coat. And then they were moving. He was an expert dancer, guiding her with an unnerving, minimalist precision. She had been taught to dance, of course. It was a necessary accomplishment for a governess, which she had once been, and a companion, which she now was. But she had not danced in years. She focused on his shoulder, on counting the steps, on not stumbling, on not breathing too loudly. The silence between them was immense. It was filled with the rustle of 100 silk gowns, the murmur of 1,000 whispers. Why had he done this? What could he possibly want? Was he mad? Or was he the cruelest of them all, turning her into a public joke for his own inscrutable amusement. He did not look cruel. That was what she noticed most sharply. He looked empty, as if he were 1,000 miles away, performing a series of memorized actions. His tawny eyes were not on her face, but somewhere over her shoulder, fixed on a point in the middle distance. The dance felt like an eternity and a second. He steered her through the turns, his hand a steady, impersonal pressure on her back. She was intensely aware of him. The clean, sharp scent of starch and cold night air, the sheer physical presence of him. She wondered if he was aware of her at all, or if she was merely an object he had chosen to set in motion. When the music finally faded, he stopped. For a moment, he did not release her. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in their depths. Not warmth, not kindness. Something more akin to recognition, as if he had been looking for a particular face in the crowd, and had just now found it. Then it was gone. He gave a short, formal bow. "Thank you, Miss—" He did not know her name. Of course, he did not know her name. The entire bizarre episode had been a whim. "Marsh," she said, her voice barely audible. "Adela Marsh." "Miss Marsh," he repeated, the name sounding foreign and strange on his lips. He turned without another word and walked back towards the fireplace, reassuming his post like a sentinel. The spell was broken. The noise of the ballroom rushed back in, louder this time. The other couples began to move again, but their eyes followed Adela as she walked, her spine ramrod straight, back to her corner, back to the potted palm. She picked up the shawl. Her hands were shaking now. She folded it, her fingers clumsy. She did not look at Lady Beaumont. She did not need to. She could feel the fury radiating from her employer like heat from a stove. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of humiliation. The whispers were no longer veiled. They were pointed, sharp. She heard her name, Marsh, spoken with amusement, with pity, with contempt. She had not been invisible. She had been an oddity, a curiosity put on display by a bored duke, and now she was simply a fool. When they finally left, bundled into Lady Beaumont's carriage, the silence was more terrifying than any tirade. Lady Beaumont sat opposite her, her face a pale, furious mask in the flickering lamplight. She did not speak. She simply stared at Adela with cold, reptilian hatred. Adela stared back at her own reflection in the dark glass of the window. A pale face, wide, frightened eyes, the ghost in grey bombazine. The Duke had asked her to dance, and everyone had held their breath. Now Adela was holding hers, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. She had been seen, and she was about to pay the price. The storm did not break that night. Lady Beaumont's fury was a cold, slow-burning fire, far more dangerous than a sudden explosion. The next morning, there was no shouting. There was only a new list of duties waiting on the small table in Adela's room. Her usual tasks, cataloguing the household linens, reading aloud, accompanying her employer on afternoon calls, were still there. But new ones had been added. She was to polish the silver, a task usually reserved for the junior housemaid. She was to mend a tear in one of Lady Beaumont's lace shawls, a piece of needlework so fine it would strain her eyes to near blindness. She was to transcribe, by hand, a dozen letters of social correspondence, her employer's handwriting being a fashionable, illegible scrawl. Each task was a small, deliberate humiliation. Each one was designed to remind her of her place. You are not a guest to be danced with. You are a servant to be worked. Adela said nothing. She took the list, went to the butler for the silver polish, and set to work in the cold, damp scullery. Her hands, already chapped from the winter air, grew raw. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were exactly what Honoria wanted. They were a concession of defeat. All day she felt the weight of the household's knowledge. The maids whispered as she passed. The footman looked at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. She was the companion who had danced with a duke. A fairy tale for a moment, and now a cautionary one. In the afternoon, as she sat by the drawing-room window, her head bent over the impossible lace, Lady Beaumont swept in. "Still at it, Miss Marsh?" she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You must take care of your eyes. They are one of your few assets." Adela did not look up. "Yes, my lady." "I have been thinking about last night," Honoria continued, pacing before the fire. "A most unusual event." Adela's needle paused for a fraction of a second. "Indeed, my lady. The Duke of Whitchurch is known for his eccentricities. His grief has made him unpredictable. One pities him, of course, but his actions were quite thoughtless. He placed you in a most embarrassing position." Embarrassing. That was the word Honoria had chosen. Not wondrous, not shocking. Embarrassing. As if Adela herself had committed the faux pas. "I am quite recovered from the embarrassment, thank you, my lady," Adela said, her voice perfectly even. Honoria stopped pacing. The silence stretched. Adela could feel her employer's eyes boring into the top of her head. "See that you are. I should not like for there to be a repeat. Any repeat. You are here to be useful, Miss Marsh, not ornamental. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, my lady." A footman entered then, bearing a silver salver. On it was a small, flat package, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string. "For Miss Marsh," the footman announced, his face carefully blank. Adela's heart began its slow, heavy thud once more. Honoria turned, her eyes narrowing. "For Miss Marsh? From whom?" "There was no card, my lady. Only this." The footman presented the salver to Adela. Her hands trembled as she took the package. It was a book. She could feel its hard, rectangular shape through the paper. Who would send her a book? "Well, open it," Honoria commanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. Adela's fingers fumbled with the knot. Inside was a slim volume of poetry. Keats. She had mentioned to a fellow governess years ago how she admired his work. How could anyone have known? There was no inscription, no note, just the book. "Poetry," Honoria sneered, peering over her shoulder. "How sentimental. From an admirer, perhaps. One of the footmen." "I cannot imagine, my lady," Adela said, closing the book. The cover was cool and smooth beneath her fingers. "Put it away," Honoria snapped. "You have work to do." Adela placed the book on the small table beside her, her mind racing. It could not be. It was impossible. And yet, who else? Who else had seen her last night? Really seen her? The Duke of Whitchurch. The thought was so absurd, she dismissed it at once. He had not even known her name. He was a cold, distant aristocrat who had acted on a bizarre impulse. He would not, could not, have sent her a book of poetry. It must have been a mistake. But the book sat there, a solid, tangible mystery. A small, quiet defiance of Honoria's narrative. "You are not ornamental," her employer had said. But someone had sent her something beautiful. From his study window, Marcus, Duke of Whitchurch, watched the grey London sky spit a miserable, sleeting rain. The fire crackled in the grate, but the room was cold. The whole house was cold. It had been cold for 11 months and 3 weeks. Ever since James, he closed his eyes. He did not want to think about James. He had spent the better part of a year not thinking about James. He had managed his estates, sat in the House of Lords, attended the requisite social functions. He had done everything that was expected of him, all while encased in a thick layer of ice. Last night, at the Beaumont ball, the ice had cracked. He had not intended to go, but his mother, the Dowager Duchess, had insisted. "You cannot hide forever, Marcus. Life must continue." So he had gone, and it had been just as he expected. A suffocating press of bodies, perfume, and meaningless chatter. The young ladies, pushed forward by their mothers, all had the same practiced smiles, the same empty eyes. They looked at his title, his fortune, his estates. They did not look at him. And then he had seen her. She was standing in a corner, so still she was almost invisible, dressed in a gown the color of a winter dawn. She was not trying to catch his eye. She was not trying to catch anyone's eye. She was simply there, a point of stillness in a churning world. There was a quiet dignity in her posture that belied the menial task of holding another woman's things. He had watched her for half an hour. He had seen the way her employer, the garish Lady Beaumont, treated her. The casual dismissiveness. The way she was used as a prop. And he had seen the way the young woman, Miss Marsh, he knew her name now, had borne it, with a silent, unbreachable composure. She was not empty, like the others. She was contained. A walled garden, quiet and deep. And he had felt an impulse he had not felt in a year. A desire to do something. Something unexpected. Something to shatter the glossy, brittle surface of the evening. He wanted to see what would happen if he walked over to that still point, that quiet garden, and opened the gate. So he had. He had not thought beyond the act itself, the walk across the floor, the request, the dance. He had felt the shockwave travel through the room. He had felt the trembling of her hand in his. He had felt the rigid terror in her spine. And he had felt a kind of grim satisfaction. He had disrupted the predictable orbit of their world, just for a moment. But it was more than that. Holding her, moving with her in the circle of the waltz, he had felt something else, a flicker of connection. Her silence was not empty. It was watchful. He had the distinct impression that while everyone else in the room was looking at the Duke of Whitchurch, she was the only one looking at the man inside the title. And she had seen the emptiness there. He had returned to the fireplace, the ice reforming around him. But the crack remained. This morning he had woken with her face in his mind, the wide, intelligent eyes, the mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. Adela Marsh. He had sent the book on another impulse. He had asked his man of business, a walking encyclopedia of London's inhabitants, to find out who she was. A Miss Adela Marsh, Your Grace, daughter of the late Reverend Michael Marsh of Sussex, well-educated, penniless, currently employed as a companion to the widow of Sir Alistair Beaumont. Penniless. Of course, it explained the grey dress, the position, the fear in her eyes. He had walked to Hatchard's himself, a thing he never did. He had browsed the shelves, the scent of paper and leather, a welcome respite from the cloying perfumes of last night. He had seen the volume of Keats, and remembered a line from a letter James had once written him from school. "Beauty is truth. Truth, beauty, that is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know." He had bought the book, and had a footman deliver it, with no card. It was a foolish, sentimental gesture. He was the Duke of Whitchurch. He did not make foolish, sentimental gestures. And yet, he had. He turned from the window. The house was too quiet. The silence was no longer peaceful, as it had been when his brother was alive to fill it with laughter and terrible violin practice. Now it was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He needed to get out. He called for his coat and hat. He would walk. He did not know where. He just knew he could not stay here, in this cold, silent house, with the memory of a woman in a grey dress who had looked at him and seen the truth. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle by the time Adela was permitted to leave the house. One of her new duties was to walk Lady Beaumont's pair of spoiled, pug-nosed spaniels. It was a task she did not mind. It granted her an hour of freedom from the oppressive atmosphere of the house, even in the damp chill of a London afternoon. She led the dogs towards the park, her head bent against the wind. In her pocket, her fingers found the smooth cover of the book of poetry. She had not been able to read it yet, not under Honoria's watchful eye, but she had kept it with her, a secret talisman. The park was nearly deserted. A few hardy souls hurried along the paths, their heads ducked low. The trees were bare, their black branches stark against the grey sky. It suited her mood. She let the dogs off their leads in a small, enclosed green, and they immediately began yapping at a flock of pigeons. Adela found a damp bench and sat, pulling the book from her pocket. She opened it to a random page. Ode on a Grecian Urn. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. She read the line again. A quiet ache spread through her chest. It was how she felt about her own life. A collection of unheard melodies, hopes and dreams that had never been given voice. A shadow fell over the page. Miss Marsh. The voice was low, familiar. Her head snapped up. The Duke of Whitchurch stood before her, a tall, dark shape against the grey light. He held no hat. Raindrops glistened in his raven hair. Her heart did a frantic, panicked stutter step, twice in 2 days. It was not a coincidence. It was a pursuit. "Your Grace," she stammered, scrambling to her feet and dropping the book. It fell open in the wet grass. He bent in one fluid movement and retrieved it, his long fingers surprisingly gentle as he brushed a smear of mud from the page. He held it for a moment, his gaze on the open poem. What little town by river or seashore or mountain built with peaceful citadel is emptied of this folk, this pious morn? He read aloud, his voice quiet, contemplative. He looked up at her. A question for which there is no answer. She stared at him, speechless. "You received my delivery, I see," he said, handing the book back to her. It was not a question. So it was him. The confirmation sent a fresh wave of panic through her. "Your Grace, you should not have. I cannot accept—" "It is a book, Miss Marsh," he interrupted, his tone dry. "Not the crown jewels. Are you forbidden from reading?" "No, but it is inappropriate. For you to send it, for me to receive it. My employer." "Ah, yes. Lady Beaumont," he said, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than coldness in his eyes. Contempt. I imagine she was not pleased. She was not, Adela admitted, her voice small. And the dance? He asked, his gaze direct. Was she pleased about the dance? Adela looked away, towards the yapping dogs. My pleasure is not Lady Beaumont's primary concern. He was silent for a long moment. She risked a glance at him. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. No, he said slowly. I did not suppose it was. He looked around the damp, empty park. Do you enjoy your work, Miss Marsh? The question was so direct, so personal, it caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that. Her life was a matter of necessity, not enjoyment. It provides me with a roof over my head, Your Grace. A roof is not a home, he said, more to himself than to her. He gestured to the bench. May I? She nodded, stunned, and sat. He sat beside her, leaving a careful, respectable distance between them. The two of them, a duke and a companion, sitting on a wet bench in a deserted park. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. Why did you ask me to dance? The question slipped out before she could stop it. It was bold, impertinent. But she had to know. He did not seem offended. He stared straight ahead at the skeletal trees. I am not certain, he said, his voice low. I was tired of the noise. You were quiet. Quiet. The word should have been an insult. Plain. Uninteresting. But the way he said it, it sounded like a virtue. I have found, he continued, still not looking at her, that society is composed almost entirely of noise. People talking but saying nothing. Smiling but feeling nothing. It is a performance, and I have grown weary of the play. Adela thought of the ballroom, of Lady Beaumont's brittle laughter, of the meaningless chatter. He was right. But you are a part of that world, Your Grace. I am a duke, he said, the title flat, a statement of fact, not pride. My presence is required. My feelings on the matter are irrelevant. He finally turned to look at her. You, on the other hand, you were in the room, but not of it. You were watching too. I saw it in your eyes. He had seen that. He had seen her, a person with thoughts and feelings, not just a grey shadow in the corner. My brother, James, he said, and his voice changed, roughened with a grief he could no longer conceal. He hated it too. He called it the Great Masquerade. He was the only one who was real. Adela's breath caught in her throat. He was speaking of his brother, to her, a stranger, a paid companion. I am sorry for your loss, Your Grace, she said, the words inadequate but sincere. He gave a short, sharp nod, as if to ward off further sympathy. He has been gone nearly a year. People expect me to be over it, to do my duty, find a wife, produce an heir. He said the words as if they were a list of chores, like polishing silver. Grief does not follow a timetable, Adela said softly. She was thinking of her own father, of the hollowed-out feeling that had followed his death, a feeling that had never truly gone away. He looked at her, and the mask of the cold duke slipped entirely. In its place was a man, raw and hurting. No, he said, it does not. One of the spaniels, having tired of the pigeons, trotted over and nudged its wet nose into Adela's hand. She stroked its head, her movements automatic. The simple tactile sensation grounded her. I should go, she said, her voice regaining its strength. Lady Beaumont will be wondering where I am. Of course, he said, rising to his feet as she did. The Duke was back, his posture stiff, his expression controlled. But something had changed. A door had been opened between them. Miss Marsh, he said, as she gathered the dog's leads. "My mother, the Dowager Duchess, is hosting a small gathering for tea tomorrow afternoon. She's a great admirer of Lady Beaumont's late husband's collection of Roman coins. I believe she intends to send an invitation. She would be most pleased if you were to accompany your employer." Adela stared at him. An invitation to his mother's house. This was no accident. This was a deliberate, calculated move. "I go where Lady Beaumont instructs me to go, Your Grace." "I am counting on it," he said. And this time, it was there. A definite, unmistakable movement at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost. He gave her a curt nod, turned, and walked away, disappearing into the grey mist, leaving Adela standing with two impatient dogs, a damp book of poetry, and the bewildering, terrifying knowledge that the Duke of Whitchurch had no intention of letting her remain invisible. The invitation arrived the next morning on heavy cream card, embossed with the Whitchurch crest. The Dowager Duchess. Theodora's handwriting was a spiky, energetic script that spoke of a formidable personality. Lady Beaumont read it with a triumphant smirk. "The Dowager Duchess," she announced to Adela, as if Adela were not already aware of the plan. "She wishes to consult my knowledge of Sir Alistair's coin collection. His Grace must have mentioned my expertise. It seems my standing in society is finally being recognized at the highest level." Adela, who was arranging flowers in a vase, said nothing. Lady Beaumont's expertise consisted of knowing the collection existed in a locked cabinet to which she did not have the key. "She requests that you attend as well," Honoria added, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. "To take notes for me, of course. My memory for dates can be so fleeting." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Honoria's memory was like a steel trap, especially for slights and social details. The Dowager's request was a command, and to refuse would be to offend the very person Honoria sought to impress. She was forced to bring Adela along. "Of course, my lady," Adela said, snipping the end of a rose stem. "Wear your brown silk," Honoria commanded. "It is modest. We would not wish for you to appear forward." The brown silk was Adela's best dress, reserved for church on Christmas and Easter. It was still plain, but the fabric had a slight sheen, a hint of life that the grey bombazine lacked. It was a concession, Adela knew. Honoria wanted her to look presentable, but not attractive. A neat brown sparrow next to a bird of paradise. Whitchurch House was on a grand square, a palace of pale stone that seemed to command the entire space. It was imposing, even severe, from the outside, but inside it was different. There was no oppressive new money gloss like at Beaumont House. There was the quiet gleam of old wood, the scent of beeswax and dried lavender. Portraits of generations of sharp-featured ancestors watched from the walls. The house felt old, settled, as if it had grown from the land. It felt like a home. They were shown into a drawing room that was flooded with afternoon light. A fire roared in the hearth, and in a wing-backed chair beside it sat the Dowager Duchess of Whitchurch. Lady Theodora was a small woman, made smaller by her widow's blacks, but she possessed an energy that filled the room. Her white hair was piled into an elegant coif, and her eyes, a startlingly bright blue, missed nothing. They were her son's aristocratic features, softened by age and a wry intelligence. "Lady Beaumont," she said, her voice crisp and clear, "how good of you to come. And this must be your companion, Miss Marsh." She extended a hand not to Honoria, but to Adela. Adela, startled, curtsied, and took the offered hand. The Duchess's grip was surprisingly strong. Her blue eyes held Adela's for a moment, and in their depths, Adela saw the same assessing intelligence she had seen in the Duke's. But here it was tempered with something else: curiosity and perhaps kindness. "I am so pleased you could join us, my dear," the Duchess said, before turning to Honoria. "Do sit down, Lady Beaumont. My son will join us shortly. He is so looking forward to hearing about Sir Alistair's numismatic treasures." The lie was delivered with such perfect, pleasant sincerity that Honoria beamed, completely taken in. She launched into a vague but enthusiastic speech about the collection, while the Duchess listened with an expression of polite interest, her eyes occasionally flicking towards Adela. Adela sat on a small, straight-backed chair, a little apart from the main conversation, as was her role. But here it felt different. She was not hidden behind a plant. The Duchess had placed her where the light from the window fell upon her. She was included in the circle. The Duke arrived a few minutes later. He greeted Lady Beaumont with cool formality. Then his eyes found Adela's. He gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod. Acknowledgement. Confirmation. "We planned this. You and I." He took a seat near his mother, and the conversation about the coins continued, with Marcus occasionally asking a pointed question about provenance or minting that sent Honoria into a flustered flurry of hand-waving and subject-changing. It would have been comical if it were not so cruel. Adela felt a pang of something almost like pity for her employer, who was so desperate to impress and so clearly out of her depth. The Duchess, seeming to sense this, smoothly steered the conversation to a new topic. "Marcus tells me you are a reader, Miss Marsh." All eyes turned to her. Adela's cheeks grew warm. "I enjoy it when I have the time, Your Grace." "What do you enjoy?" the Duchess asked, her head tilted. It was a genuine question. "Poetry, mostly," Adela said quietly. "And history." "A sensible combination," the Duchess declared. "Beauty and fact. One needs both. Our library here is quite extensive. Marcus's father was a compulsive collector. You must see it one day." "An invitation? Another one?" Adela glanced at Honoria, whose smile had become a tight, painted line. "Miss Marsh has little time for such frivolous pursuits," Honoria said quickly. "Her duties keep her quite occupied." "Nonsense," the Duchess said, waving a dismissive hand. "All work and no play makes Jane a dull girl. Is that not right, Marcus?" "Indeed, Mother," the Duke said, his eyes glinting with amusement. "A mind like Miss Marsh's should not be occupied solely with linens and lapdogs." The shot was so direct, so perfectly aimed, that Adela had to bite her lip to keep from smiling. Honoria's face paled. She had been insulted in the grandest house in London, and the insult had been delivered by a duke. Tea was served. Adela was handed a cup of the finest porcelain, thin and delicate. She was offered a plate of tiny, perfect cakes. She was treated not as a servant, but as a guest, an equal. The feeling was so foreign, so heady, it was almost frightening. This was a world she did not belong in, a world she was only visiting on a temporary pass. When it was time to leave, the Duchess took Adela's hand again. "It has been a true pleasure, Miss Marsh. I do hope we will see you again very soon." The words were for her, but the look was for Honoria. A warning, a statement of intent. "This young woman is under my notice. Treat her well." The carriage ride back to Beaumont House was silent. But it was a different silence from the night of the ball. That had been the silence of rage. This was the silence of confusion and fear. Honoria had been bested, and she did not understand how or why. The Duke and his mother, the most powerful social arbiters in London, had taken an interest in her drab, quiet companion. It made no sense. And what made no sense to Honoria Beaumont was dangerous. That evening, for the first time in a week, there was no extra list of duties on Adela's table. There was only the book of Keats and the memory of an hour spent in the light. The weeks that followed were a strange, suspended time. Adela's life became a study in contrasts. At Beaumont House, Honoria's cruelty took on a new, more insidious form. The physical punishments ceased, replaced by a campaign of psychological warfare. She would praise Adela in front of guests for her simple, rustic honesty, making her sound like a milkmaid. She would forget to have a place set for her at luncheon, then apologize with extravagant, false pity. Every day was a fresh minefield of small, carefully placed humiliations. But then there were the visits to Whitchurch House. The Dowager Duchess, true to her word, found numerous reasons to invite them. A consultation on a charity committee, a viewing of a new painting, a musicale with a visiting pianist. And each time, the invitation was explicitly for Lady Beaumont and her companion. Honoria, caught between her desire to curry favour with the Duchess and her resentment of Adela, was forced to comply. These visits were Adela's sanctuary. In the calm, sunlit rooms of Whitchurch House, she could breathe. The Duchess treated her with a gruff, forthright kindness, asking her opinions and listening to her answers. She gave Adela the run of the library, a vast two-story room that smelled of leather and history. Adela would lose herself for hours in its quiet aisles, a book in her hand, the weight of Honoria's house lifting from her shoulders. And there was Marcus. He was often there, in the library. He would be working at his great mahogany desk, a mountain of papers before him. But when she entered, he would look up. That quiet nod of acknowledgement, the silent conversation that passed between them. Sometimes they would speak. Their conversations were never long, never overtly personal. They spoke of books, of politics, of the changing face of London. But beneath the surface of the words, something else was growing, a current of understanding, of recognition. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood. A tension in his jaw meant he was wrestling with a difficult estate problem. A slight softening around his eyes meant he was thinking of his brother. He never spoke of James again, not directly. But Adela felt his grief as a constant, quiet presence in the room, a shadow to which she alone was given access. One afternoon, she found him staring out the library window at the rain-swept square. He did not turn when she entered. "They wish to sell his hunter," he said, his voice flat. "The stable master says it is too expensive to keep a horse that is not being ridden. His brother's horse." Adela came to stand a few feet away from him, following his gaze. "It is a fine animal," she said softly, though she had never seen it. "James loved that horse," Marcus said. "He called him Hotspur. He said the horse had more spirit and courage than most men in the House of Lords." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. He was probably right. He was silent for a moment. "I should sell him. It is the practical thing to do." "Practicality is not always the most important thing, Your Grace," Adela said. He turned to her then, his tawny eyes searching her face. What is more important? Memory, she said simply. He held her gaze for a long, charged moment. He did not look away. He did not retreat behind the mask of the Duke. He just looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of the raw, unguarded man from the park. He was letting her see him. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I will not sell the horse." It was a turning point. A choice made not from duty or practicality, but from the heart. And she had been his witness. The change in him, after that, was subtle but undeniable. The ice was melting. He began to join his mother and Adela for tea. He would ask Adela about the book she was reading, his questions sharp and insightful. The almost smiles became more frequent. Once, when she recounted a particularly absurd statement made by one of Honoria's society friends, he let out a short, surprised bark of laughter. The sound was so unexpected, so real, that it made her heart ache. Honoria saw it all. She saw the thawing of the Duke, and she saw that Adela was the cause. Her jealousy, which had been a simmering pot, began to boil over. She could not forbid Adela from going to Whitchurch House, but she could make her life a living hell when she returned. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. The Dowager Duchess had arranged a trip to a new exhibition at the Royal Academy. Honoria, pleading a headache, had declined, but had been forced to allow Adela to go as the Duchess's guest. It was the first time Adela had gone anywhere under the Duchess's protection without her employer. She had spent a glorious afternoon looking at paintings with Lady Theodora and Marcus, feeling for a few hours like a normal young woman, like a friend. Marcus had bought her a small catalogue of the exhibition. When he had handed it to her, his fingers had brushed against hers. The touch was electric, a sudden, shocking jolt of awareness that left her breathless. When she returned to Beaumont House, her face flushed with happiness, she found Honoria waiting for her in the hall. "You enjoyed your little outing?" Honoria asked, her voice dangerously soft. "Yes, my lady. The paintings were magnificent." "I am sure they were," Honoria said. "It seems you are finding more and more to enjoy outside of your duties here. Perhaps you no longer find your position suitable." Adela's blood ran cold. "That is not true, my lady. I am very grateful for my position." "Are you?" Honoria's eyes were cold and hard as pebbles. "It seems to me you have become discontent. You have aspirations above your station, Miss Marsh. The Duke and his mother have filled your head with nonsense, but they are toying with you. You are a novelty to them, a pet. When they tire of you, they will cast you aside. And then, where will you be?" Every word was a poisoned dart. Adela stood silent, her hands clenched around the exhibition catalogue. "I have been thinking," Honoria continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "that this arrangement is no longer working. Your services are no longer required. I will give you a month's wages. I expect you to be gone by the morning." Gone. The word echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of the hall. Gone where? She had no family, no friends to turn to. A dismissal without a letter of recommendation was a death sentence for her prospects. She would be on the street. She looked at Honoria's triumphant face, at the cruel satisfaction in her eyes. This was what she had wanted all along, to break her. But Adela did not break. She thought of the Duke's quiet voice in the library. She thought of the Duchess's kind, intelligent eyes. She thought of the book of poetry in her room. She was not the same frightened girl who had stood by the potted palm. "Very well, my lady," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I will pack my things." She turned and walked up the stairs, her back straight. She did not run. She did not cry. She had lost her home, her livelihood, her future. But she would not give Honoria Beaumont the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. She was halfway up the grand staircase when the front door opened again. It was the Dowager Duchess's footman. He carried a letter. He looked from the furious Lady Beaumont at the bottom of the stairs to the pale, composed Adela at the top. "A message for Miss Marsh," he said, his voice loud in the tense silence. "From the Dowager Duchess of Whitchurch." Honoria's face contorted in a spasm of rage. Adela turned and walked back down the stairs. She took the letter. Her name was on the front, in that spiky, energetic hand. She opened it and read. It was short. "My dear Miss Marsh," it began. "I find myself in sudden and desperate need of a new companion. My last one has run off with a Welsh choir master. The pay is abysmal, the work is tedious, and my temper is famously short. But the library is excellent. The position is yours if you will have it. I shall expect you in the morning. Yours, etc., Theodora Whitchurch." Adela looked up from the letter. She met Honoria's gaze. For the first time, she did not look away. She saw not a powerful society matron, but a small, frightened woman, terrified of being overlooked. "It seems," Adela said, her voice clear and strong, "that I have found a new position. Thank you for the month's wages, my lady. I will have no need of them." She turned, and without a backward glance, walked up the stairs to pack her few belongings, leaving Lady Beaumont standing alone in her cold, silent hall, utterly and completely defeated. Adela was free. Life in the Dowager Duchess's household was like stepping from a cramped, dark cellar into an airy, sunlit garden. Adela's room was twice the size of her old one, with a window that overlooked the square. Her duties were, as the Duchess had promised, sometimes tedious. She read newspaper editorials aloud until her throat was hoarse, and wrote letters to the Duchess's innumerable cousins. But they were tasks given with respect, not malice. More often than not, her primary duty was simply to be there, to sit with Lady Theodora by the fire, to walk with her in the park, to provide a sounding board for her sharp, witty observations on society. "The woman is a fool," the Duchess declared one afternoon, snapping a newspaper shut. "Honoria Beaumont. Always has been. Married a man 3 times her age for his money, and has spent the last 5 years trying to convince the world she is an aristocrat. The only thing aristocratic about her is her talent for cruelty." Adela, who was sorting silks for the Duchess's embroidery, merely smiled. She no longer felt the need to defend herself or her former employer. The past was a closed book. Her new position also meant she saw Marcus almost every day. He was no longer an occasional visitor to her world. She was now a fixture in his. They fell into a comfortable, easy rhythm. Morning encounters in the library, shared teas in the afternoon, quiet evenings when the 3 of them would sit in the drawing room, the Duchess embroidering, Adela reading, and Marcus staring into the fire. His presence a warm, solid comfort. The wall of his grief was still there, but it was no longer an insurmountable fortress. It was more like a ruined abbey, a place of sorrow, yes, but one where light could now get in. He began to talk about James, sharing small anecdotes of their childhood, of his brother's wild schemes and infectious laughter. Adela listened, her quiet attention a balm on the old wound. She was falling in love with him. The realization came to her not in a sudden flash, but as a slow, dawning certainty. It was in the way her heart lifted when he entered a room. It was in the way she found herself searching for his face across a crowded drawing room during one of the Duchess's soirees. It was in the profound sense of peace she felt just being near him. She knew it was hopeless. He was a duke. She was a paid companion. The chasm between their stations was as wide as the ocean. He enjoyed her company. He respected her mind. He was grateful for her friendship. But love? Marriage? It was the stuff of foolish fairy tales. She guarded her heart carefully, determined not to let her feelings show. But Marcus was watching her, just as she was watching him. One evening, his mother had retired early, leaving them alone in the library. A storm was raging outside, beating rain against the long windows. Adela was trying to read, but the words blurred on the page. She was too aware of him, sitting in the chair opposite, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. "You are happy here, Adela?" he asked, his voice low. He had started using her given name a week ago. The first time he had said it, her heart had stopped. It still had the power to unmoor her. "Yes, Marcus," she said, not looking up from her book. "Very happy. My mother is fond of you. The feeling is mutual." "And I?" he asked, his voice even lower. "Am I fond of you?" Her breath caught. She finally raised her eyes to meet his. He was watching her with an intensity that made the air crackle. The book lay forgotten in her lap. I believe you consider me a friend, Your Grace," she managed. "Marcus?" he corrected her gently. "And yes, a friend. The first true friend I have had since—" He did not need to finish the sentence. "But it has become more than that, has it not?" It was not a question. It was a statement. He knew. He had seen into her carefully guarded heart and read what was written there. She could not speak. She could only look at him, her own feelings exposed, vulnerable. He rose from his chair and came to stand before her. He did not touch her. He just looked down at her, his tawny eyes dark with an emotion she could not name. "You have brought life back into this house, Adela," he said, his voice thick. "You walked into the middle of my winter, and you did not flinch. You just waited. You saw me, the man buried under the ice. No one has done that before." Tears pricked her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. "I do not know what to do with this feeling," he confessed, a note of raw frustration in his voice. "I am a duke. I have duties, responsibilities. I am expected to make a suitable marriage, a marriage of convenience, of title and fortune." "I know," she whispered. "But I do not want a suitable marriage," he said, taking another step closer. "I do not want a marriage of convenience. I want—" He stopped. The silence stretched, filled only by the drumming of the rain and the beating of her own heart. Why had he stopped? Why hadn't he continued? He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment, before his fingers gently touched her cheek. His touch was hesitant, questioning. It was not the assured, possessive touch of a duke, but the tentative gesture of a man afraid of being rejected. She leaned into his hand, a silent surrender. A tear she could no longer hold back escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. He caught it with his thumb. "Adela," he breathed, his voice a ragged whisper. And then he bent down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, of fire. It was a kiss of profound, aching tenderness. It was the taste of rain and sorrow, and a deep, quiet longing. It was the sealing of a silent pact that had been forged between them over weeks of shared glances and quiet conversations. It was everything she had secretly, hopelessly wanted. When he pulled away, his eyes were shining. The last of the ice was gone. "I love you," he said, the words simple, stark, and utterly terrifying in their implications. Before she could answer, before she could process the world-altering power of those 3 words, the library door opened. It was the butler, his face pale. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. There is a visitor, a Lady Beaumont. She insists on speaking with you. She says it is a matter of the utmost urgency." Honoria. Here. Now. The spell was shattered. The warmth in the room turned to ice once more. Marcus straightened, his face hardening into the familiar mask of the cold Duke. But Adela saw the fury in his eyes. "Tell Lady Beaumont I am not available," he said, his voice clipped. "I have tried, Your Grace. She will not leave. She says if you will not see her, she will make her urgent business known to all of society tomorrow." It was a threat, a piece of blackmail. Adela felt a cold dread seep into her bones. What could Honoria possibly have that she thought was powerful enough to threaten a duke? Then she knew. It was not about him. It was about her. Honoria had been digging. She had found some piece of Adela's past, some vulnerability, and she was here to use it as a weapon to destroy this fragile, impossible happiness. The final act of cruelty had begun. Honoria Beaumont was shown into a small, formal receiving room, a room designed for unwelcome visitors. Adela remained in the library, her heart a cold stone in her chest, while Marcus went to face her. The Duchess, woken by the commotion, joined Adela, her face grim. "That woman is a viper," Lady Theodora said, taking Adela's cold hand in her own. "Whatever she has, we will face it." But Adela knew that whatever Honoria had, it was meant to wound Adela in a way that would make her untouchable, even to a duke. It would be about her past, her poverty, her father. Reverend Michael Marsh had been a good man, a scholar and a dreamer who had cared more for ancient languages than for balancing his accounts. When he died, he had left behind a wealth of knowledge and a small but humiliating collection of debts. Adela had worked for years as a governess to pay them off, living frugally, sending every spare shilling to his creditors. She had thought them all settled. But what if one remained? What if Honoria had found it? In the eyes of the ton, to be in debt was a moral failing, a stain that could not be washed away. The minutes ticked by. 10, 15. Adela could hear the faint murmur of voices from the hall, a low, controlled rumble that was Marcus, and a higher, more insistent tone that was Honoria. Finally, the voices stopped. The front door closed with a heavy, final thud. Marcus returned. He did not look at Adela. He walked to the fireplace and stood with his back to them, staring into the flames. "Marcus," his mother prompted, her voice sharp with concern. "She is gone," he said, his voice flat. "What did she want?" the Duchess pressed. "What was her urgent business?" Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of all emotion. "She came to inform me that Miss Marsh's father died a bankrupt, that he owed a considerable sum to a tailor in his village, a debt that remains unpaid." Adela's world shrank to a single point of cold, sickening shame. It was true. The debt to Mr. Trimble, the tailor. It was the largest one. She had been sending him small payments every month, but it was slow work. She had not imagined anyone would ever know. She has the promissory note, Marcus continued, his voice still unnervingly calm. She purchased it from the man. She informed me that if I were to continue my association with Miss Marsh, she would be forced to present the note for collection. Publicly. Perhaps at the upcoming ball my mother is hosting. She thought it would make for excellent conversation. He turned around. His face was a pale, rigid mask. He looked not at his mother, but directly at Adela. His eyes were unreadable. This was it, the test. He had said he loved her, but she was a penniless companion with a bankrupt father and a public debt. He was the Duke of Whitchurch. Love could not bridge a chasm this wide. He would be kind, of course. He would be discreet. He would have his man of business settle the debt, and then he would gently, regretfully, end their association. He had to. His duty, his name, his position demanded it. I see, Adela said, her own voice a faint echo in the grand room. She stood up, her legs unsteady. I understand. Your Grace, I will leave in the morning. I would not wish to cause you or your mother any further embarrassment. She had to get out of the room before she shattered into 1,000 pieces. She turned to go. Stop, Marcus commanded. The word was not loud, but it had the force of a physical blow. She froze, her back to him. You will do no such thing, he said. He walked towards her, stopping directly behind her. She could feel the heat of his body, the fury that was radiating from him in silent waves. You will not leave this house. You will not let that venomous, pathetic woman win. He moved to stand in front of her, forcing her to meet his gaze. The mask was gone. His eyes were blazing. Do you think I care about a tailor's bill? Do you think I care what your father did or did not owe? Do you think, after everything, that I would let Honoria Beaumont dictate the course of my life? But your name, she whispered. Your duty. My duty, he said, his voice dropping, becoming thick with emotion, is to the woman who taught me how to feel again. My duty is to the woman I love. He took her hands in his. They were ice cold. I am hosting a ball in a fortnight, the grandest ball of the season, and you will attend, not as my mother's companion, but as my betrothed. Adela stared at him, her mind unable to process the words. Betrothed. Marriage. It was impossible. Marcus, no, she said, pulling her hands away. You cannot. She will ruin you. She will tell everyone. Let her, he said, his eyes flashing. Let her stand up in the middle of my ballroom and announce to the world that my future wife's father was a poor man of God, who was not very good with money. Let us see how society reacts when a duke stands beside the woman he loves and tells them he is proud of her strength, her integrity, her dignity. Let us see whose side they take, Adela, hers or ours. The Duchess, who had been watching with tears in her eyes, spoke up. He is right, my dear. The ton is a flock of sheep. They will follow the strongest lead. And there is no stronger lead than the Duke of Whitchurch, with me standing right beside him. Adela looked from Marcus's passionate, determined face to his mother's fierce, loving one. They were offering her a future she had never dared to dream of. A family, a home, love. But it came with a terrible risk. She could bring scandal and ruin down upon them both. I am frightened, she whispered, the admission costing her everything. Marcus's expression softened. He gently took her face in his hands. I know, he said. So am I. But we will face it together. He looked deep into her eyes. I asked you to dance once, Adela, on a whim. Now I am asking you to stand with me. For a lifetime. Will you be my wife? She looked at this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had shown her his own broken heart, who was willing to risk everything for her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, love bloomed, fierce and defiant. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong. Yes, Marcus, I will. The night of the Whitchurch ball arrived on a wave of anticipation that had gripped all of London. Rumours had been swirling for a fortnight. The reclusive Duke of Whitchurch was not only hosting the event of the season, but there was talk of a major announcement. And at the centre of the whispers was the mysterious Miss Marsh, the Dowager's new companion, upon whom the Duke was said to be bestowing an unusual amount of attention. Honoria Beaumont had done her work well. The story of the bankrupt reverend and the tailor's bill had been artfully leaked, spreading through the drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs like a contagion. Adela's name was on everyone's lips, spoken with pity, scorn, or salacious curiosity. Adela stood before the long mirror in her new room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The Duchess had insisted on a new gown. It was not white, not the colour of a bride. It was the colour of a night sky, a deep, shimmering sapphire silk that made her grey eyes look like silver. It was simple, unadorned with lace or flounces, its beauty lying in the perfection of its cut and the richness of the fabric. Her dark hair was swept up with a single string of small pearls, a gift from the Duchess, woven through it. She looked like a stranger, a duchess almost. But inside, she was the same Adela Marsh, and she was terrified. In a few minutes, she would have to descend the grand staircase and face 1,000 critical eyes. She would have to face Honoria Beaumont and the scandal she was about to unleash. There was a soft knock on the door. It was Marcus. He stood in the doorway, impossibly handsome in his formal black evening attire. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, his eyes travelling from the pearls in her hair to the hem of her sapphire gown. A slow, wondering smile spread across his face. A real smile, full and unreserved. "You are beautiful," he said, his voice soft with awe. "I'm frightened," she confessed again. He came into the room and took her hands. His were warm and steady. "I know, but look at me, Adela." She raised her eyes to his. "Tonight is not about them," he said, his voice firm. "It is not about Honoria or her pathetic little schemes. It is about us, you and me. We are simply telling the world a truth that we already know, that you are the finest woman I have ever met, and that I am the luckiest of men." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "Shall we go down together?" Together? The word was her shield and her armour. She nodded, her courage returning. They walked to the top of the grand staircase. The sound of the orchestra and the chatter of hundreds of guests rose up to meet them. As they began to descend, a hush fell over the crowd. Every face turned upwards. Adela kept her eyes on Marcus. She saw the strength in his profile, the proud set of his shoulders. She felt the steady pressure of his hand on her arm. He was her anchor in this churning sea of silks and jewels. At the bottom of the stairs, the Duchess was waiting for them, a fierce old general ready for battle. She took Adela's other arm. The three of them, the Duke, the Dowager, and the penniless companion, stood together, a united front. The ball began. Adela danced the first waltz with Marcus. They moved as one, the sapphire of her dress swirling around them. The whispers followed them, but they did not matter. In the circle of his arms, she was safe. She saw Honoria across the room. She was dressed in a garish gown of emerald green, a bitter, triumphant smile on her face. She was holding court, her voice carrying across the floor, and Adela knew she was telling her story, priming her audience for the main event. The moment came after supper. The orchestra was taking a brief respite. The room was crowded, the air thick with champagne and anticipation. Honoria chose her moment perfectly. She moved to the center of the room, her voice rising, sweet and clear as a bell. "My dear friends," she began, and the room fell silent. "As you all know, I have always believed in charity, in lending a helping hand to those less fortunate." Her eyes, full of mock pity, found Adela. "That is why I took in poor Miss Marsh after her father, the Reverend, passed away, leaving her with nothing. Or rather, less than nothing." She paused for dramatic effect. "He left her with a mountain of debt, a fact she was not entirely honest about." A collective gasp went through the room. It was happening. The public humiliation. Adela felt Marcus's hand tighten on hers. Honoria held up a piece of paper. The promissory note. This, for instance. A rather large sum, owed to a simple village tailor. A debt of honor, one might say, that has gone unpaid for years. One must be so careful whom one invites into one's home. Such deception is... That is quite enough, Lady Beaumont. Marcus's voice cut through the silence like a sword. He did not shout. He did not need to. The authority in his tone was absolute. He and Adela stepped forward into the center of the room. He took the promissory note from Honoria's stunned hand. He barely glanced at it. "Lady Beaumont is correct about two things," he said, his voice ringing with clarity. "Miss Marsh's father was a man of God who cared little for worldly wealth. And I have no doubt he died in debt." He looked at Adela, his eyes full of love and pride. "She has spent years working to pay off those debts herself, in secret, without complaint, because she is a woman of unparalleled honor and integrity." He turned his gaze back to the stunned crowd. "These are the qualities I value: honor, integrity, dignity in the face of hardship, quiet strength that outlasts loud cruelty." He let his eyes rest on Honoria for a fraction of a second, a look of such withering contempt that she physically recoiled. "These are the qualities of the woman I love," he announced, his voice soaring. "And these are the qualities of the next Duchess of Whitchurch." He turned to Adela, ignoring the explosion of gasps and murmurs. He went down on one knee. "Adela Marsh," he said, his voice for her alone, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. The fear was gone, replaced by a love so vast it filled the entire room. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh yes, Marcus." He stood, took her in his arms, and kissed her, right there, in front of all of London. The crowd, after a moment of stunned silence, broke into spontaneous, thunderous applause. They had followed the strongest lead. Adela looked over Marcus's shoulder. Honoria Beaumont was standing alone, the center of attention no longer. People were turning their backs on her, their faces cold. She looked small and pathetic and utterly defeated. Her cruelty had brought her nothing but her own ruin. In that moment, Adela felt not triumph, but a wave of sad, quiet pity. Marcus took her hand and led her back to his mother. The Duchess was beaming, her blue eyes bright with tears. "Well done, my children," she said, her voice thick Well done." The orchestra struck up another waltz. The Duke had claimed his Duchess. The story was complete. Epilogue. 6 months later, the Duchess of Whitchurch stood in the long gallery at Falcondale, the family's country seat. The late afternoon sun of autumn slanted through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and the faces of generations of Whitchurch ancestors in their gilded frames. The house was no longer cold. Adela had brought life back into its silent rooms. She had ordered fires to be lit in every hearth, flowers from the garden to be placed in every room. On her first night here, she had requested that the great, long dining table, built for state dinners of 50 guests, be shortened. Now she, Marcus, and the Dowager Duchess ate at a small, round table at one end of the vast room, their conversation and laughter no longer lost in the echoing space. She ran a hand along the cool oak of a windowsill. The estate had begun to heal, just as its master had. Marcus had thrown himself into the management of the land with a newfound energy. He had met with tenants, planned new drainage systems, and overseen the replanting of a wood that had been neglected for years. He had not sold Hotspur. The horse now carried him across the fields each morning, a living, breathing link to the brother he had lost, but now remembered with love, not just pain. The library at Falcondale was even grander than the one in London, and it had become her sanctuary. But the whole house was her home now. She was no longer a ghost in grey, but the lady of the manor, respected by the staff, and slowly, cautiously, loved by the local gentry, who had been won over by her quiet grace and lack of airs. She heard footsteps behind her, and turned. Marcus stood at the end of the gallery, watching her. He was dressed in riding clothes, his boots dusty, his dark hair tousled by the wind. The cold, aloof Duke of the London ballrooms was gone forever. In his place was her husband, his eyes warm, his mouth curved in a familiar, gentle smile. He walked towards her, his steps echoing on the polished floorboards. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "I was just saying hello to your ancestors," she replied, smiling back at him. "Making sure they approve." "They have no choice," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. He came to stand beside her at the window, his arm sliding around her waist, pulling her close. "Their new Duchess is far too charming to dislike." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the rolling hills, golden in the autumn light. "Do you remember that first night?" he asked quietly. "At the ball?" "I try not to," she teased gently. "I do," he said, his expression turning serious. "I remember seeing you and feeling a jolt, as if the world, which had been grey and out of focus for so long, had suddenly snapped into sharp, clear colour. You were the only real thing in the room." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And I remember a terrifyingly grand Duke, who looked as though he were 1,000 miles away." "I was," he admitted. "Lost. Until you helped me find my way home." He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face. "Thank you, Adela, for seeing me, for waiting for me." "There was never anyone else to see," she whispered, her heart full. He bent his head and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss of profound contentment. It was a kiss that held the memory of a silent dance, of a book of poetry, of rainy parks and fireside confessions. It was the kiss of a man who had been saved, and the woman who had quietly, patiently shown him the way. The light outside began to fade, but in the long gallery of Falcondale, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of the future, the Duke and his new Duchess were bathed in a warm and everlasting light. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.